so sometimes I do something else and I forget I have to post it. So please just remind me. I try to remember right away, and usually I'm pretty good, but every now and then it does slip my mind. All right, so are there any questions before we start today's lecture? All right, then let's start today's discussion. So we stopped last time talking about the aggregate demand curve, right? And we stopped last time talking about why it sloped downward, right? The wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. So just like chapter 4, we're going to talk about why it slopes downward. And now what we're going to talk about is why it shifts. So we go from why does it slope downward to how does it shift? So just like before, we're going to have reasons why it shifts. And the reasons why aggregate demand curve shifts are going to be changes in consumption, investment, government purchases, or net export that are not overall price level. So it can't be like the CPI that changes, but it can be something else related to prices, but not the overall price level. So it can't be CPI that changes, but it could be some other part. So the example we have here, kind of a quick example. What happens when we have a stock market boom? So kind of what we're going through right now. High level of the stock market increasing. So if the stock market is going up, I look at my retirement savings. Some of you have that already. Some of you don't. At some point you will or should. And what I see with my retirement savings is I am now wealthier because the stock market has gone up. So I feel wealthier. And because I've seen this rise in the stock market, and I feel wealthier, what do? Well, I decide I'm going to increase my consumption because then I can now afford, in quotation marks, I can afford more stuff because it looks like I'm going to have more in the future. So what I do is I adjust some of my future wealth and spend it today. So I increase consumption. And when we increase consumption, aggregate demand shifts. And because it's an increase, aggregate demand will shift right. So just what we have here, right? Aggregate demand ends up shifting right. So because we have this increase in the stock market and we feel wealthier, we do have this increase in consumption, which shifts aggregate demand right. This is what we talked about. So I kind of laid out the reasons. Everything goes back to what we've talked about already. So why does the aggregate demand curve shift? Changes in C. This could be due to stock market boom or crash. You could also add in, instead of stocks, you could do the same thing with housing. Replace the term stock with the term housing, and you get the same kind of relationships. See, you guys are getting too young now, but the last time we saw this was in 2008. We're actually seeing it again now. As housing prices rise, people feel wealthier. And as they feel wealthier, what's going to happen is we're going to start to increase consumption. Right now, it's kind of in this weird situation because we're kind of limited in what we can buy. So we kind of have this saved up wealth that we're willing to spend, which kind of leads to the second preference. So some of these preferences can be going on at the same time. The second preference is also going on. We also saw this in 2020. In the United States, what we saw is this preference for savings because we were worried about the pandemic. So what happened is, either because people were worried or because they were locked in their houses, either way, not so much here in Arkansas, but in other states, is that we saw this huge influx of savings. I said a lot of individuals, especially those who did not lose jobs, saw their savings increase. One, because they decided to save more money as a worry of the pandemic, or other reasons. But when savings increases, so remember back from chapter 13, we talked about savings increases. This actually causes consumption to fall. So when we save more money today, that actually causes aggregate demand to shift left. It's a weird phenomenon. It's referred to as the saving paradox, or the paradox of savings. Keynes talks about this. I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but there's this huge discussion about how sometimes saving money doesn't help the economy. And that's true, right? It doesn't help the economy in the short run. However, if we save more money, in the long run, we're better off. Just because it works for, same thing works for individuals. If I save money today, I won't be as happy because I can't buy the newest iPhone. I can't buy the newest car. However, in the future, because I save today, I'll have more to spend in the future. So it's a trade-off, just like it is for countries, it is for individuals. And finally, taxes affect consumption. We increase taxes, consumption goes down. We decrease taxes, consumption goes up. Pretty simple there. It doesn't matter to whom. It works for everyone. Everyone, if they have more money to spend, they're going to spend it. If you increase their taxes, they're going to spend less money. There's not an income to that. It's everyone. Next one is changes in I. Now, investment. What I like to talk about, students, and when you think about investment, right? This is done by businesses. So why are businesses going to invest money? Well, businesses are going to invest money based on what I call future profitability. If I think the world is great and I think the world's going to be great, I'm much more likely to invest today. Why? Because I see the future as being profitable. So if I think its future is going to be profitable, I'm going to, as a business, kind of load up. I'm going to build new factories so I can build new products. I'm going to expand because I believe that my products are going to be bought in the future, that there's going to be this consumers that want it because they're going to be wealthier and they're going to want to buy my products. So if I expect the world to be better off, I'm going to invest more. However, on the flip side, if I think the world's going to be worse off, I'm going to invest less. So Keynes kind of refers to these phenomenons as animal spirits. Is that sometimes businesses overreact. Is when times are good, they think things are going to be great forever, so they might overinvest. When times are bad, they think it's going to be bad forever, so they underinvest. And so they overreact to optimistic periods and pessimistic periods. And so Keynes says there's this worry that animal spirits by businesses can drive a lot of fluctuations in the economy. And they find that to be true, right? Because remember, we talked about investment, right? If GDP drops, it's most likely due to some kind of investment change, about 2/3 of it. Other things that can change investment, interest rates, right? We've talked about those already. Lower interest rates lead to more investment. We're also now going to talk about how monetary policy can affect real variables. This only happens in the short run. So it's a short run phenomenon. But we're going to talk about how they influence the economy and kind of through this low nominal interest rate. So we're going to talk about this in chapter 21. But I just add it here because on the test, I don't say, well, in chapter 20, no. changes in I are going to occur because of monetary policy, which we're going to focus in more details in 21. And then finally, this one we've already talked about. Right? We talked about that in chapter 13, right? Right, in chapter 13, we talked about the investment tax credit and how that encourages more investments. Next one, change in G. Pretty much anything where the government is buying stuff. Defense, roads, schools, all of those count as a change in G. Change in net export. What causes net exports for a country to change? How well other countries are doing. If other countries are booming, that's going to increase net exports, right? Because they're going to buy more of our stuff. If other countries are in recessions, that's going to cause a decrease in net exports. There is also some based on appreciation and depreciation resulting in international speculation. Not a whole lot of that does occur, but not at a great rate. If I'm going to ask a question about net exports, I'm more than likely going to focus here on how other countries are doing. So remember, the United States, this is not really a big impact for us. If we look at it, overall trade in the United States, remember, it's only about 30% of our economy. However, when we go to other countries, right, they run economies where it's 100 to 150% of their economy is worked through trade. So their exports and imports almost equal what they do in overall GDP. A lot of European countries, this matters to. So for them, how other countries are doing booms and recessions matters. For the US, usually we only matter to other countries. Not to be kind of arrogant, but kind of. Is that when the US suffers, other countries suffer because they're dependent on importing goods to us. So when we have a recession, we don't buy as many goods from them. So it can cause recessions in other countries. I'm not going to spend any time going through this today. We're a little short for time, but please work these active learning assignments. You should work them on your own, right? So you should go, okay, investment tax credit expires, investment decreases, aggregate demand decreases, exchange rate falls. A fall in the price level increases the real value. State government replace their sales tax with new taxes on interest. So if I stop taxing consumption, people are going to consume more, aggregate demand increases. So kind of what I did really quickly, you should be able to do on any statement I give about the economy. You should just be able to kind of formulate what happens there. And then when we get to later on in the chapter, we're going to talk about how does that affect the equilibrium. But you should first be able to do this. So that's the aggregate demand curve. Now we're going to move on to aggregate supply. So aggregate supply is a little funky because there's two aggregate supply curves. We have a short run aggregate supply curve and a long run aggregate supply curve. Why do we have different aggregate supply curves? Well, let's start first with the long run. So the long run aggregate supply is, you have lots of fancy terms for it. It's the natural rate of output, it's potential output, it's full employment output. The way to look at it is we're using everything efficiently. So at long run aggregate supply, right, for the US economy, we should be right around 5% unemployment. This is potentially what we can do if we utilize our resources efficiently. Are we running things smoothly? And when we run things smoothly, here's the long run aggregate supply. That's where we want to be. It's kind of the ideal location. And so remember when we talked about productivity. Right, we talked about human capital, physical capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. So when you think of long-run aggregate supply, these are the 4 factors you should be thinking of. We didn't talk about the price level because it didn't matter. Because based on how much human capital, physical capital, natural resource, and technological knowledge I had, that determined what our output is. So we're still staying with that idea. And that idea holds true in the long run. So we have this vertical line, prices don't matter. So if prices increase, it doesn't change how much human capital, physical capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge that we have. Right? So we refer to this, remember, as classical dichotomy. P doesn't change real GDP. So that still holds true. So how do we get changes in the long run aggregate supply? Well, I get an increase in immigration. I get more human capital. When I get more human capital, assuming the human capital is productive and it's here to work, then what it will do is it will increase our stock of labor, which increases aggregate supply to the right. So anytime we change long run aggregate supply, what we're going to change is the output. So kind of why might they shift? Changes in human capital. So immigration, baby boomers retire. Government policies to lower the natural unemployment rate. So that would be things like removing unions, removing the minimum wage, right? Lowering regulations. Remember, in class, we're just talking about how this occurs. Remember, everything comes with a cost. Okay, so this is just the benefit. If I do these things, I can reduce the natural unemployment rate, which is going to cause us to shift right. Again, remember, everything comes with a cost, and we should recognize that. When we advocate for these things as well, understand that there's a cost. How do I change K, our human capital? Invest more in factories, more people get education, doesn't have to be a college degree, but more people are educated either through skills, ways it's destroyed, things like hurricanes, earthquakes, natural disasters. How do we change natural resources? Things like that, something that comes from there. And we talked about how to improve technological knowledge. We've talked about these already, right? This is chapter 12. We should just go ahead and write this. We talked about all of those in chapter 12. So we talked about that. So that's chapter 12. So you're hopefully starting to see where all these chapters are lining up in this material. Now, the difference we have here between not just the long run, but why the short run works is something called the short run aggregate supply. And it's upward sloping. So what happens is price level can change our output. And it does it in a short run time period. So what can happen in the short run is we can run, but we're going to talk about is we can run. We can either run too fast or too slow. So sometimes when we see prices, what happens is we decide to speed up. So when we do that, we can't increase output in the short run. We may not be able to maintain it in the long run, but we can increase it in the short run. Kind of the way I want you kind of think about it is the economy is kind of like a marathon. The long run aggregate supply says I'm going to run a 5-minute mile all the time. However, some racers don't do that. Sometimes they speed up and run faster miles, and sometimes they slow down and run slower miles. So kind of the way to think of short run aggregate supply is kind of the miles along the path to get to the long run. So what we have here is chances to overheat or underperform. And so short run aggregate supply, therefore, is upward sloping. So why this matters is with aggregate supply being vertical, if we changed aggregate demand, nothing would change on output. Output would always remain based on productivity. And that is true in the long run. How wealthy we are only depends on how productive we are. Nothing more, nothing less. However, in the short run, we do see periods of too hot and too cold. So we do see periods, what we call an inflationary period, where money is running, or prices are running hot, or we see a period of recessionary times where things are running too cold. Right? We don't have enough, so we have high unemployment, right? And our GDP growth is negative. So we have both hot times, inflationary, prices are going through the roof. And we have cold times where we have high unemployment and growth. So why does aggregate supply slope upward? Reason one, we'll call it. We'll talk about it here in a second, but we're just going to talk about sticky wage theory. So some of the problem with prices changing and why we don't see this perfect long run aggregate supply. Because in the long run aggregate supply, wages would adjust according to the situation. However, we know that from chapter 16 or 17, I can't remember now. I think it's chapter 17. We talked about things like menu cost. We talked about how prices don't move together. They're sticky. Because as a business, I don't want to change my prices all the time. Based on economic conditions, I try to keep a price and try to keep it that way for 3, 6, 12 months. Same thing works with wages. Your boss doesn't come in and say, well, the economy's doing pretty bad today. I think we're going to lower our wages. Or worse, when the economy's doing well, I'm going to raise your wage. No, they kind of keep wages the same. And that's due to quite a few kind of economic, well, kind of social constructs, we'll call them. One of them is actually a contract. Is you sign a contract declaring how much you're going to work for. These are usually popular with unions. Teachers do this as well. So we sign a contract to say how much you're going to pay me for the whole year. And they usually don't change it one way or the other, up or down. Other ones for businesses where they don't have contracts, they don't change it because that's not how we do business. Now, as economists, we might think it's a better way to do business, but we also understand that there's a culture and there's ideas around us that aren't strictly always driven by pure economics. So we recognize that there's some social norms that prevent prices from moving up or down a lot. Also fairness, kind of in the same idea. Because it's not fair to change prices all the time. It wouldn't make it easy for individuals. We try to keep wages very sticky. So what firms and workers do then when we agree on prices is we put a price that we expect to prevail. So we're going to take a wage that we expect to be valuable for us moving forward, that we're able to accomplish what we want to with those wages. And what those wages are valued in the market. So we come to some arrangement, we call it PE, based on what we expect the prices to be. So what happens if prices are above what we expect the prices to be? Well, that means the firm's making more money, it's more profitable. And so when the firms are more profitable, what they do is they increase output. And when they increase output, that's going to cause GDP to increase. Well, how do they do this? Well, a lot of times the way firms do this, you've been around, is they just start, they don't really increase employment. They add hours to your workday. Sometimes right to where overtime comes from. And as economists, we're not so mad about overtime because what that's going to do, remember, is push that price upward. And that price upward is now going to move closer to what the actual price is to hopefully smooth things out. But it doesn't always. Because as long as the firm's more productive or more profitable, it's going to increase output. But just like we have a sticky price, just like we have sticky wages, we also have sticky price, which I don't really like. I wish sticky wages would just fall underneath here because wages are nothing but prices, but they separate them out. And so we have some discussion here about sticky prices. We also have something called the misperceptions theory. We're going to kind of skip through that one, but please read it in the book. Well, mostly it has to do with I don't see the world because I don't understand only my little viewpoint. It's kind of how you need to think about it. Is I only see what I see. I don't see the big wide world around me. And it works really because a lot of people are what they call myopic. They only see what's around them. They don't see the big picture. What these theories do is they kind of give an explanation of why Y isn't YN. So why we aren't on the long run aggregate supply curve. Because what we have is this imbalance between what we expect the price level to be and what it actually is. Why this doesn't matter in the long run is because in the long run, these two things are the same. So that's why the long run, we just have the up and down line. However, in the short run, prices deviate and they change. And we still respond to them in the short run about what we do and how we work. So back to my example about the marathon, right? So if all of a sudden, as a business, I see that I can make a lot of money in the short run, what I do is I sprint for the next mile or two. And I know, though, if I sprint, I can't finish the race. So what happens then is I slow back down after I take advantage of the unexpected situation. So that's kind of what this is. It's unexpected. I didn't know what was going to happen to prices because I didn't know I had to make an adjustment. And then I decide how my adjustment will be. It kind of lays out the graph, what we just showed there, and it shows you how it corresponds to on the graph. So we talked about that. So why does the short run aggregate supply curve shift? Same thing, same reasons long run aggregate supply curve shifts. So if LRS shifts, so does short run aggregate supply curve. Those two things always move together. So we also see some shifts in short run aggregate supply. And what we also see short run aggregate supply curve shifts is what I like to call business costs. So they're input costs to the business that aren't going to change in the long run, but they are going to have some short run effects. So maybe there's higher wages. They pass new laws to increase wages. So what's going to happen is we're going to shift left and we're going to end up at a higher price point. So we always end up on long run aggregate supply. We'll get there. Now we might get there with some more inflation or less inflation, but we'll always end up on the long run aggregate supply. It just takes us a little while. So things like higher wages, regulation cost. And they also talk about, the book talks about natural resource costs. Sometimes they call it raw materials. All of these are going to be related to how much the business costs. There's also things like corporate taxation. Right. So when we talked about taxes before, we were talking about taxes on individual income or sales. Here, what we're talking about is taxes on corporations, how much they earn. And because of that, that can cause short-run aggregate supply to shift either right or left. So in balance, we end up with the long-run equilibrium. That's where everything magically comes together. We can sing an old Beatles song about it, but that's where we're going to come together. Everything meets. So here's where we usually start from. So every time we're starting now in class, we're going to start with this beautiful long-run equilibrium. So if we start at the long-run equilibrium, here's how we're going to analyze economic fluctuations. I probably could have wrote this for chapter 4. All right. The only difference is we have a long-run problem. But if this was chapter 4, what did we do? Well, does it affect demand or supply? First thing. If it affects this, does it cause it to decrease or increase? Got it. Once I do that, I draw it on the graph and see what happens to output and prices. Okay, but remember the difference between chapter 4 and chapter 20 is we do step 1, step 2, and step 3 in chapter 4. In chapter 20, we're going to do an additional step. We're going to move the economy back to long-run equilibrium. It doesn't just stay there. All right, so let's go through this. And the easiest way to do this is for you to take out a sheet of paper and work through this. So hopefully you have a sheet of paper with you. I'll try to go a little slower so you can draw it. So draw a quick graph with all three of those things lined up together. All right, now that you have everything lined up together, let's talk about a shift. So remember, one reason either supply or demand shifts. We could actually get both long-run aggregate and short-run aggregate supply curves to shift. But it's either going to be a demand shifter or a supply shifter. Don't try to shift both. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about a stock market crash. So a stock market crash makes us feel less wealthy. We feel less wealthy, right? That's going to affect consumption. So consumption will decrease. So will aggregate demand. Right? That's what we talked about, C and AD. So we know aggregate demand decreases, so we know to shift it left. And when we shift it left, we get our new line here. And then we just connect the dots. So we find this new line. We find where it hits short-run aggregate supply to give us our short-run equilibrium. So our short-run equilibrium is B. And what do we notice at B? At B, prices are lower, so is output. And remember from the beginning of this chapter, when output is lower, unemployment is higher. So hopefully everyone got that. Now the problem where students get stuck. Okay, I can do A to B. Got it. I got it taken care of. Not a problem. Now let's figure out how to get to the long run. Here's how this works. Long run always stays constant. Once I move aggregate demand, unless I talk about another thing in here that causes aggregate demand to shift, I still keep my aggregate demand line. So I'm keeping my aggregate demand line and I'm keeping my long run aggregate supply line. So what I know then is I got to get back to long run because point B isn't on the long run because it's not on the long run curve. So somehow I'm going to have to get to the long run. Well, since I'm keeping AD and long run aggregate supply, what I know is I'm going to have to end up there. How do I get there and why do I get there? Well, As unemployment becomes higher, it becomes easier for businesses to hire workers. Why? Because there's lots of people unemployed. So wages start to decrease. And so the cost to businesses decreases. Remember when I talked about the cost of businesses to decrease, that's one of the things that affects short-run aggregate supply. And so what happens is short-run aggregate supply shifts right, and we end up at point C. And what we notice at point C is output and unemployment haven't changed. The only thing that's been affected is prices. So the economy has this way to self-regulate. It can get back to equilibrium, and it will. We'll talk about what do we do as the government here in a little bit. But right now, we're not focusing on the government part. We're just focusing on what happens. Okay, so we're going to do another one real quick. ADAS. What happens to the U.S. economy? A boom occurs in Canada. So what should happen? I'm going to go through this one quickly. You can work it at home if you want. Boom in Canada, NX shifts right, so does aggregate demand. Boom, we're at a new point with higher prices and outputs, and unemployment is lower. So what's going to happen in the long run? Well, in the long run, I keep aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. So I have less unemployment. So as a business, it's going to cost me more to pay my workers. As it costs me more to pay my workers, short run aggregate supply shifts left. So we end up at a point C. Now here's a question that always gets students. Which point is better, point C or point A? The answer are they're about the same, right? GDP per capita hasn't changed, whether it's A or C. The only thing that changed is the number on the bill. And I can still buy the same things in world A that I can buy in world C. Okay? Except how I count the dollars that I'm spending is different. So here's what happened in the, well, gosh, it's almost 60, 70 years now, 50 years. So we see something that happened in the 1970s. And there was this huge oil price increase because of what they call OPEC. Because of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, what happens is prices of oil shot up because they controlled it. They were a cartel. They could control most of the oil market. And because they controlled most of the oil market, they were able to decrease supply by a significant number to increase prices. What did that do to the U.S. economy? Well, what that caused is this increase in cost shifted our short-run aggregate supply. And what it did is it shifted it left. What happens when we shift left? Well, when we shift left, we get the worst of both worlds. We get high inflation and high unemployment. So when we shifted aggregate demand, we only got one bad thing. We only got either higher inflation or higher unemployment. We didn't get both. With short-run aggregate supply, we can actually get both. And we refer to this situation as stagflation. It's a unique period in economic situations where we can have falling output, higher unemployment, and rising prices. So it's kind of a rare situation that can occur. And we saw it significantly in the late 70s. So if we do nothing in the long run, we're going to move from point B back to point A. We'll get there. It just takes a long time. However, we could also try to government intervene, and that moves us to a new point with a lot more inflation. So this kind of gives you chapters in the nutshell very quickly. That's kind of where we're at there. Since we have a little bit of time, what I'm going to do is we're going to go back through and work some of those problems a little bit more. I have another set of slides to work that a little easier. So what I'm going to do is take off the presentation from this one, and I'm hopefully going to open up some new slides so we can go a little quick slower here and talk about exactly what happens. So where students struggle in this chapter, so I got a little bit of time, so we're going to try to do this here, is they struggle with this right here. It's how do things change and what happens with it when they do. So let's go back through and let's really work through some of these examples we did. We did this one in detail, so I don't have to go back through that one. So let's go back and let's look at this Canada one again since we have some time. So I look at there and I see a couple of words. So when I read these prompts, it's what students sometimes struggle doing is reading the prompt. So what's the prompt asking me? Okay, it's telling me, here's the event. So it's telling me what's called either the shock or it's the event that occurs. Either way is correct. If you read economic textbooks, they'll sometimes talk about a shock to the system. So what changed in the system that caused our diagram to change? So here's the shock to the system. So we have a boom in Canada. Well, since it's it's one of our best trading partners, our highest quantity of trading partners, our highest dollar value. So it does going to have an impact on the US economy. So now what I want to do is I go through here and it wants to tell me what are the long run and short run effects on GDP, price level, and employment. Okay, so now for the test, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this, the event. And I'm going to tell you I want either a short or a long run effect. And I'm going to pick, well, either I want GDP, price level, and or employment. So on a test, you have to know all of it. Now because I'm only going to ask bits and pieces of it, just the way you give tests as economist. Okay, I'm not going to ask you for everything. I'm only going to ask you for bits and pieces because I'm kind of testing to see if you can understand it. If you can hopefully if you can tell me what happens to GDP in the short run, I'm going to assume you know it all. That may be a bad assumption, but that's what we have to do with the test. So let's look at this boom in Canada. So a boom in Canada, I know is going to affect net exports because as Canadians are richer, they're going to want to buy more US goods and services. And so when they want to buy more US goods and services, we're going to export more there. So as we export more there, what happens is that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift right. And when it shifts right, we get higher prices, higher GDP. Just like chapter 4. If demand increased in chapter 4, price and quantity increase. Okay, in chapter 20, we just call it aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand increases, both price and quantity here, the price level and real GDP increase. And when real GDP goes up, unemployment goes lower. So boom, I get point A. That's short run. How do I know it's not the long run? Well, I know it's not the long run because it's not on the long run aggregate supply curve. I know what you guys are thinking. Well, Dr. Wong said, well, duh. Well, I will tell you right now, it saddens me to say this. But somebody on the next test will tell me point B is in the long run. It happens every semester. Even though I make this point, I'm trying to help you along and make sure you don't make the mistake. I love it to be the semester that no one tells me point B is in the long run. And they tell me, because Dr. Walshide, the long run has to be on the long run aggregate supply curve. So we know we're at this new aggregate demand curve. We know only one event has occurred. So I know I can't change aggregate demand again. So to make us into the short run, back into the long run, what happens is short run aggregate supply is going to shift. So think of short run aggregate supply kind of as our corrector. It's how we correct the economy. It's how we correct without intervention. So if the government doesn't get involved, the short run aggregate supply will correct the economy. And how it corrects is at point B, we have low unemployment. So that means as a business, it's going to cost me more and more for my workers. And if it's going to cost me more and more for my workers, that increases my business cost. And when I increase my business cost, it shifts short run aggregate supply to the left. And so what I end up with is point C. I get point C with relatively higher inflation and same standard of living. The only way to change standard of living, which we talked about in chapter 12, in the long run, the only way we become richer is we become more productive. We change long run aggregate supply curve. Changing aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply is only a temporary fix or correction. It's the long run that changes our path in the future. Francisco, what would be another event that could shift aggregate supply back down? You could increase government taxes. We could have we'll talk about it later. We have a decrease in money supply, housing market crash. Businesses are worried about the future. They think there's a lot of uncertainty and they don't trust what's going to happen in the future and they're pessimistic. You could go through any bit of that list of why things change. Higher interest rates. I look disfavorably on companies that invest. All of those things could change aggregate demand to the downward. I hope that kind of gives you some examples there. And then we also have it with short run aggregate supply. We talked about this one and we talked about stagflation. Kind of some points to remember from these questions. The economy will always adjust back to the long run. Okay, I guess I probably should put here without government intervention. Next week, we're going to do the government intervening. Okay. So we talked about before, standard of living depends on the long run aggregate supply. So remember, we see very similar to chapter 4. On each of these tests, I let you use scratch paper. Draw the graph. You should start, okay, I'm here. Okay. So I shift aggregate demand. Well, what happens? Oh, short run prices definitely increased, as did output. But I know in the long run, I can't change my output. So somehow I have to get back there. So it's easier to do when you visualize and draw the graph out. Doesn't mean you have to. Again, I don't pick up scratch paper, nor will I. because it's yours and you're at home, and I'm not running to your house to get the scratch paper, nor am I going to make you show it to the examining proctor. But I would suggest you have it if you have not already. Have a couple of sheets of scratch paper there. Okay? Show the proctor that you have scratch paper, which I allow, and draw the graphs. All right, are there any questions in from chapter 20? So if you understand the economic fluctuation, things will be a lot easier.